Hello and welcome from the World Economic Forum in Geneva. I'm Adrian Monk. Welcome to the Great Reset Dialogues. We'll be talking this hour about recovering and rebuilding from 2020, and we'll be hearing from leading experts about their views on what we need to do to address the economic, health and societal challenges ahead. Joining us in this hour, we have George Osborne, the former UK Chancellor, and now businessman and journalist. We have Dambisa Moyo, an economist joining from the US, Vali Nasser from Johns Hopkins University in Washington, DC, from New York. We have historian Adam Tooze, and we have joining us Tammy Tam, the editor-in-chief of the South China Morning Post. So a lot of interesting perspectives and viewpoints to come in the next hour. But I'd like to hand over to my colleague, the president of the World Economic Forum, Birger Brender, to chair this dialogue.
Thank you so much, Adrian. We have had a very interesting year, I would say. We started in March, where we had to pivot into digital events. We were known for our analog events, and we have had this every week now, with hundreds of CEOs calling in. And so we have had, on average, thousands of people every week watching this, of our members and partners. Thank you for doing that. And I have to admit at the end of the year that this year for me feels like a decade. It has accelerated a lot of processes, like going digital, but also all the challenges we've been faced with, of course, has led to a more vulnerable world, but we are now hopefully seeing some light in the end of the tunnel with the vaccine, and hopefully more of a V-shaped recovery. We will see. Great panel today. We're so happy that you could join us. And I think it would have been an omission not to start with the United Kingdom and with George Osborne, former Chancellor, and as Adrian said, no successful businessman, editor. George, I think we're all now following like we did with the presidential elections in the US, we were following from minute to minute. No, it seems like the focus has come back to London and the UK. Are we going to see a Brexit deal? And who knows the outcome of this?
Well, it's great to take part, and congratulations to you, Birger, and the West for adapting to this extraordinary year. I think the short answer is we are going to see a deal. This might be a foolish prediction because it could be proved wrong in the next 24 or 48 hours. But I will hazard a guess that we are going to see a Brexit deal. I think it's important to remember, of course, we've already left the European Union at the beginning of this year in January. And what we're really talking about here is the ongoing trade and regulatory arrangement between the UK and the former colleagues of ours in the European Union. It's not a situation I wanted to be in. I fought for the campaign to keep Britain in the EU. But we are where we are. And it's clearly now a very sharp choice. Does Britain essentially exit all of our existing trade and other arrangements with the EU? Or do we put together some deal which won't be as comprehensive as people would like, but at least offers stability and continuity over the new year? The deadline is 31st December. There's been a lot of negotiation. It's come down in many ways to those sort of basic issues which were all there all along with EU membership and the referendum campaign. How much sovereignty are you prepared to pool in order to have access to other parts of the market and reassure Europeans you're not going to undercut the regulations? And there's been a bit of, frankly, nationalist rhetoric on both sides of the argument, because one of the complicating factors in all of this is the president stepping in at the last moment to demand greater access for French fishers in northern France. I don't think it's fair to portray it all as a kind of nationalist Britain, the rule makers in the process. But nevertheless, I think the reason we can have some confidence now that we're close to this deal is that the last remaining issue is fishing. And as you'll know from Norway, and I will tell you from Britain, fishing is an emotive subject, even if it's economically not as significant as most sectors of the economy. But if you're arguing about fishing, there is a deal to be done, because it's about where boats can go and how much fish they can catch. And that's the kind of space where a deal can be constructed. The other big sticking point was around level playing field rules and whether Britain essentially could become less regulatory in the environmental or social or employment space, or do more regulatory. But it seems as if there's been a breakthrough in that space. And that, to me, was always the risk. If they couldn't get a breakthrough there, then maybe the talks were found. That's much more fundamental about our ongoing relationship with you. Once you're down to how much cod and hake you can catch, there's a deal to be done, and we won't flounder.
No, thank you for that. And as you said,
I couldn't resist.
No, and fishing can be, and fisheries can be a very sticky thing, as you said. I know it also from Norway. When we negotiated Norwegian EU membership, our fishery minister was called No Fish Olsen in Brussels, because we had zero to give. But I think relatively wise, fishing is even a little bit less important in the UK. Provided, though, that there will be a deal between the UK and the EU. Where do you see the UK-EU relationship develop in the years to come?
Well, the basic truth is that the whole of British history has been about our relationship with our near neighbours. And quite a lot of European history has been about our relationship with Britain. So that is not going to end just because we've left the European Union. Is the departure from the EU just one step of a journey we were already taking by not being in the euro? In other words, there's a core group of Eurozone nations who are heavily integrated, and then everyone else, whether they're non-Euro, Eastern European, Norway,
So you're breaking up a bit, George.
Okay, did
I wonder if there is the relationship between the continent and the island already is a bit frosty.
We maybe have to come back to him.
So I think we will come back to you, George. I'll then go to Dambisa.
Let me, can you hear me now?
Yeah. Let's try. Okay. I think the link is not the best. We might come back to you, George, if it improves. But let me then go to Dambisa Moyo. I touched on the global economic outlook. I said that it looks a little bit better than we thought some months ago. I don't know if you agree. What kind of economic situation will we be facing in 21? Is the recovery going to be a bit more V-shaped than U-shaped? And are we doing all what we can at this point to make sure that the recovery is as sustainable and also as we should? Over to you.
So I think what's really important to your question is we are going to have to separate the difference between a rebound and a recovery. And just to put that in context, even before the global pandemic hit this year in earnest, the global economy was already in a precarious place. The growth rates in developed and developing economies were already slow, low, and in some cases no, as in non-existent. For example, Germany, Q4 2019, 0% growth. The UK, a paltry 1.2, 1.3% growth. This was again before COVID hit. And then you have the very large emerging economies. These are ones that have at least 50 million people in the population, places like Brazil, like Argentina, South Africa, again, growing at very low rates. And by that, I mean below that minimum 3% per year that you need in order to double per capita incomes in a generation. So that was problem number one, low growth. It's actually been exacerbated with COVID. Point number two is public policy was already relatively impotent. And by public policy, I'm talking about monetary policy. We were already concerned about negative interest rate environment, but also fiscal policy. Debt and deficits were already at precarious places. The Congressional Budget Office in the United States in 2016 was already forecasting that by 2030 and beyond, we would be very worried about the sustainability of entitlement programs like Social Security, et cetera. In this respect, fundamentally, what the COVID, advent of COVID has done is to accelerate, as you pointed out in your earlier comments, a lot of the challenges that the global economy was already grappling with. And that leads me to the third group, which is really a whole sort of smorgasbord of headwinds. We were worried about technology and the risk of a jobless underclass, demographic shifts, both in terms of the quality and the quantity of the workforce, issues around income inequality and the breakdown of social mobility, concerns around climate change and natural resource scarcity, and of course, as I mentioned a moment ago, just the sheer amount of debt the global economy and developed economies in particular were carrying before COVID hit. All of these things have been accelerated. As I said, this means that what we've seen from the pandemic is essentially catalyzing a lot of the challenges that we were already worried about before COVID-19. So what does this mean looking forward? So I am of the view, like many people around, that yes, we will see a sort of a bump up. We've seen that already. I mean, of course, we've seen a lot more asset price inflation in the stock market, driven by the stimulus, etc. But I do think the fact that aggregate demand was actually shut off in the form of lockdowns means that when we are all vaccinated and allowed to go and have dinners and parties with our friends again, you will naturally see some form of a rebound that will be reflected, I think, in 2021, albeit I think probably later in the year than earlier. But for a more fundamental point, and I'll end here, is that looking ahead, these structural challenges that I went through earlier, low growth environment, and because of that, an environment in which we're really quite deflationary and the forecast for equity returns remains pretty weak. All of this suggests to me that we are going to head towards a much more progressive environment, in which government becomes much bigger arbiter of capital and labor. Government becomes much more tax dependent and aggressive, much more regulation. I think, and I fear, we'll see a shrinkage in the private sector. We've already seen the sort of delistings, about 50% over the past 10 years from stock markets. I think we will continue also to see more and more deglobalization, which we've seen in trade, in capital, in immigration, in terms of global standards, and of course, in terms of the power of multilateral institutions. So it's a pretty bleak picture. I will just comment lastly, just to say that fortunes are going to be made. And so we can talk about that later. I mean, I don't think we have the luxury of being the generation that will see the world come to an end. And so it is going to be important for boardrooms in which I serve, but also public policy, to start to think about recasting the narrative in a constructive way, whether it's around technology or a green economy, or indeed more engagement with China. I really think that that's the story that needs to take place. Thank you.
Dambisa, just related to what we can expect now from the largest economy in the world, the US. The first time we have a female secretary at the Treasury. We know, of course, the G2 issue, China-US, is something that we're all very much interested in, how the Biden administration will take that forward. What do you expect from a change in the economic policy approach with the Biden administration compared to the Trump administration? Will we see more focus on structural changes, on infrastructure, digital, but also the greening of the economy? Or is there little resources left because of the debt and already the big stimulus? There will be maybe one additional round and maybe one after that. But then I guess there is less possibility to really use the big money on these issues too.
I'm more in the latter camp, I'm afraid. I think, of course, superficially in terms of, diplomacy and proper language of engagement, I think we'll see a shift. But fundamentally, all the structural problems that I laid out are things that, you can't just solve by some kind of a magic wand. And so there may be broad aspirations around greening the economy, et cetera, and in fact, including a sort of more specific infrastructure build. But there's so many corrosive problems in the US economy around underinvestment in education, particularly among minorities, issues around infrastructure. The American civil engineers grades American infrastructure as a D+. And as you pointed out, what levers degrees of freedom does public policy really have, even albeit in a reserve currency, when the debt to GDP ratio is over 100% now, and growth is continuing to slow. So I want to be optimistic and constructive, but I think we oughtn't be naive about what the challenges are. I wouldn't count the US out. I mean, it is in many sense ring-fenced, clean air, it's got energy independent in many respects, et cetera. But I think it's going to be a very, very steep hill to turn this situation around.
George, you're back also, I think, with a better connection. You heard Dambisa. You're also the former Chancellor of the Exchequer. You also, I think, work a bit with BlackRock. When you heard what Dambisa now said about the global economic outlook and also the European outlook, where do you stand? You see like a W or a K, or are you more optimistic and you see that there is no more speed in the global economy and we'll see more of a V-shaped recovery and we're doing the right things and the pandemic will be over by the end of next year and then we will be back in a higher growth environment and inflation will not be a problem?
I'm a little bit more optimistic, but I'm, sadly ready to be proved wrong. I think fundamentally, and I'm here talking about Western economies rather than some of the emerging economies, the vaccine is there. Or vaccines. Already in the UK, over 100,000 people have been vaccinated this week. And that is obviously now taking place in the United States and will take place on the European continent and in Asia. And there's a huge amount of stimulus in the system. And I don't think the damage, and certainly this is BlackRock's assessment too, is anything like the permanent damage, as anything like from the global financial crash 10 years ago, the permanent loss of output. So there of course is damage, and it's particularly at a micro level in particular sectors like entertainment, restaurants, and so on. And there will be an unemployment challenge, but at the same time, there's an enormous amount of stimulus in the system still flowing through. I think a common mistake policymakers think that you can, you turn the taps off and on, and the water flows off and on immediately. It takes a while for it to flow, and then it takes a while for it to stop flowing, even if you start to tighten policy. That aligned with a Biden administration, that is going to be more expansionary, although the US Senate control is going to be a key issue, exactly how much more expansionary. And I think, the rest of the ingredients are there for a pretty impressive 2021, particularly as you get to the sort of middle part of the year and many of these Western populations are largely vaccinated, or those who are most vulnerable from the disease are vaccinated. So in the short term, I'm quite optimistic. I think there are, of course, medium-term challenges that we're very familiar with on productivity and bringing low-skilled people into the labour force, and the kind of geopolitical tensions that we're very familiar with, and we talk about at the WEF. I guess I'm a kind of optimist there that human ingenuity, rather like with the COVID crisis, does find a way through. But I think one of the kind of classic issues of 2021 is to look out for, however, is going to be the increasing sort of division between those countries that have had access to the vaccine, that have been able to vaccinate their populations, and those countries that either have not had access to the vaccine or not been able to deploy it in a kind of effective way. And I think that division is going to become starker at the end of the year and be a problem, both for those countries affected and for sort of general geopolitical tensions.
No, you're mentioning productivity. I think that's a major issue also for Europe. The World Economic Forum came out with its annual competitiveness report this year. It's the first time since 1979 we don't rank countries. We look at the overall competitiveness because the complexity is now related also to the COVID. But looking at the United Kingdom, is still the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, and with a Brexit deal, provided there will be a Brexit deal, what do you think the UK will have to take of economic steps moving forward to still stay competitive, to keep that place in the ranking? And I guess also you're concerned by the growing debt, because if you look at the amount of money used now on stimulus, it's one of the highest in the world. So there is a lot of challenges for the Chancellor around the corner.
Yes, indeed, we're lucky to have a very capable Chancellor, and I wouldn't say that about all people who've been either did the job before or after me. So I think you have to, there are two things worth thinking about. I mean, first of all, fundamentally, the UK remains a highly competitive open economy compared to most others. So it's not as strong as it would have been if we'd stayed in the European Union or had a comprehensive trade and services agreement with the EU, but it's still a very attractive place to go. And it's interesting, quite a lot of the firms that had big contingency plans for moving large numbers of their workforce to the European continent have not implemented those contingency plans. It's happened at the margins, but it hasn't happened yet on a big scale. And so I think the cost of Brexit is going to be a much longer term loss of kind of productivity and trend growth rate, but the UK is going to remain amongst the most open and competitive economies. I think a big question for the UK is, does Brexit signal a move in a more protectionist direction in general? And after all, the communities that voted for Brexit wanted a greater protection from globalization. Or is it an opportunity to go for what people here are calling Singapore on the Thames? And as we know, when the West meets in Singapore, that's often not the realities of Singapore, but nevertheless, that's what it's called here. Do we go for do we use the advantage, if you like, of not being in the EU to go for a sort of lighter, less regulatory, more competitive economy? That, I would say, as someone on the conservative, would be the approach I would take, but I'm not sure there's the popular consent for it, and that's not the Brexit that people voted for. And so I think there will be quite a conflict in British politics now between those arguing for that sort of more, classically liberal approach, and those arguing for greater protections and the ability, now we're not in the EU, to intervene to protect certain industries or build up as they would be certain industries and shield people from the colder winds of global trade and globalization. But all of that will take place, I think, against a context where the UK remains a pretty attractive place to be. And if I might say, I think at the moment quite a attractive place to be in terms of valuations, because I think the currency, means that actually a lot of UK assets look pretty attractive compared to, again, others. As I say, I'm not in favour of the steps that Britain has taken over the last 5 years, but it's still one of the best places to do business.
Thank you so much, George. Before going to Vali Nasser, Dambisa, maybe you want to comment on what George just said, and overall how your perspective is on Europe in general. Will Europe, with this amazing stimulus packages that is also now focusing more on investments than consumption, come out of this crisis? Or will we see China and also the US growing faster, and Europe will be kept back in like a low growth region of the world?
So, I think George and I are playing a good game here in terms of optimist and relatively pessimist, and hopefully we've got sort of two sort of extremes in some sense of what could happen, and hopefully we're both wrong and it ends up somewhere in the middle. I did write, I should say first, my disclaimer is I just about 2 weeks ago, I've just been appointed to the board of the Department of International Trade in the UK. It was really an advisory role. So, in some respects, I have some latitude in being sort of off-piste with what the main message may be around investment and growth and trade for the country. But at the same time, I do think there's an obligation to be constructive and not just sort of negative. I did write an article earlier in the year about the merits of Europe. Europe does have things it can sell. I mean, it clearly is a leader in regulation. Some people might say that could be a drag on investment and growth. But I do think, just in terms of really clearly articulating what the USP, sort of the unique selling points of Europe are, I think the continent has struggled. And so it's very easy for people like myself to say, well, there are only three engines to that drive growth, three contributors: capital, labor, and productivity. And if you look at capital, they've got stretched deficits and debt issues. If you look at the labor markets, they're not that attractive, aging population. How do we, if you look at the OECD PISA statistics, they're quite challenged, particularly in areas of technology, which are going to dominate the labor force. And then, of course, productivity, George mentioned, I mean, and you did also, which, it's 50 to 60% of why one country grows, another one doesn't. And there's been a drag in productivity, which I think will potentially could accelerate. So, am I a big buyer of Europe? I'm afraid not. But, I think it's on the one hand, it's not in a great place, but on the other hand, I think the problems are very obvious. It's ultimately about execution and sharpening the tools that we know drive growth, such as investments in infrastructure, and making a much clearer case for why and how Europe can add to the broader context of global growth.
Thank you so much, Dambisa. Thank you for joining us. Now we're heading over to Professor Vali Nasser at Johns Hopkins. Vali, I guess this is a good day for you. You worked very closely with Mayor Pete in his campaign. You were his also diplomatic advisor. We don't know, maybe we'll find you somewhere also in the Biden administration. You're an expert on Middle East and Iran, but maybe I could first congratulate you on Mayor Pete, and maybe you could say something more general at the beginning on where we can see and will see major changes in the foreign policy of the U.S. with Biden administration, and maybe you would like to focus a bit more on the Middle East.
So thank you very much, Borge. And looking at the conversation we had about the economy, it's good to sort of couple it with how foreign policy would work out. I mean, President-elect Biden has had this major theme that America is back. That sort of is the meta-narrative that he's communicating both to Americans and to the world. And we can expect that with very short order after he takes office, he will look back to go back into the Iran nuclear deal, back into the climate deal, take the United States back into World Health Organization as sort of signature moves to signal that America's back. But I don't see a sort of a V-shaped recovery for American foreign policy, just to borrow a term from the economists. First of all, the world that the United States and the Democrats are returning to in 2021 is not the world that they left in 2016. A lot of the facts on the ground have changed. First of all, we obviously have COVID and Dambisa, the issues she raised about it globally, I think are very germane. The Trump administration has followed a very erratic foreign policy. He has damaged multilateralism. He has damaged America's leadership in a liberal international order. And both adversaries and foes have taken notice and have begun to hedge. And particularly, I think it's important to note that the Democratic victory was not convincing enough to tell the rest of the world that they cannot expect the Trump administration in 4 years' time, and that the Biden administration may not be more than a sort of a parenthesis in a continuum of populist foreign policy and domestic policy in the United States. And I think that will make the job for the Biden administration quite difficult. And those who think that there's going to be a quick snapback, that we can just forget about the Biden administration and go back to the old world order, will find it difficult. The second issue is that it's also different United States than the one that the Democrats left in 2016. There has been significant amount of institutional decay. I mean, I think it would take a year for the administration to rebuild the institutions of foreign policy, as well as other institutions, to return professionals to the jobs, to look at the damage that's been done to the State Department, to the intelligence agencies, to the Pentagon, to the interagency process. And that's going to be time consuming from the Secretary of State, from the National Security Advisor, and it should not be sort of downplayed. The American economy is still ailing. I would like to sort of believe in the very optimistic scenarios that it will bounce back, but the timeline matters. We're looking at a presidency of 4 years. Will the U.S. economy bounce back quickly within a year, within 2 years? Those could be quite decisive. And we're still grappling with COVID. And I think we're going to have after effects of this in the United States for some time to come. And it's going to, consume at least the administration in the short time period of a year. And then the deep divisions that we're seeing in the United States, particularly the transition between November and January, has proven to be unexpected and is going to leave some scars on the U.S. We are expecting that many people are expecting that Trump will try to put together a run for 2024. And even if he doesn't actually run, the very prospect of a significant portion of Republicans not accepting the legitimacy of the president, and then be preparing for a run in 2024, and what that will do to the Senate. What will it do to the stimulus? I mean, the one argument I've heard is that there is no incentive for Trump and the Republicans for fixing the economy, because largely they're going to run on that again in 2 years' time. And these are also facts on the ground. So in reality, I think the best thing that the Biden administration can do is actually to recalibrate American foreign policy where the goals of the United States are matched by the resources it can dedicate it to it. And these resources are much more meager than they had been 4 years, 5 years ago. So I think it will look for stability and predictability in American foreign policy. Stability will mean, here I will turn to the Middle East, because it's the place where the United States has looked like it can go to war again more than anywhere else in the world, is going to back away from a near war situation. I mean, Trump on the one hand says he wants to leave the Middle East, he wants to end endless wars, and then has brought the United States very close to war. And the element of war here is Iran. And I think the very first thing that the Biden administration will try to do is to stabilize and de-escalate with Iran, which is back away from maximum pressure and try to get to stability with Iran on the nuclear issue, have them abide by the nuclear deal before you can envision a much bigger deal, get them to follow a more moderate policy in the region and not create crisis, and then try to end wars in Libya, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Syria, where you can. And so that, I think, means a de-escalation with Iran. It means Iran will have to be allowed to sell oil, sanctions will be lifted. And I think Iranians will look to get back into the global economy. I mean, the price that they would want for stability is actually a serious return to where United States and Iran were in 2016, 17, before Trump took over. So that's where I see things going.
Vali, just at the beginning, you said there will be no going back to the situation 4 years ago. And we're not going to see a V-shaped geopolitical or a V-shaped recovery for U.S. foreign policy. But at the same time, you were saying that with lifting sanctions and bringing Iran in again, you will, I guess, not be able to revive totally the JSPOA then. But what are you saying? If the US are lifting sanctions, the Iranians will then come up with a plan to stop the development on the nuclear side? Is that what you're saying? Or do you think it's possible to revive the JSPOA?
I think revival of the nuclear deal is quite possible, and both sides have signaled that they want to go to a scenario of compliance for compliance, which means go back to 2017. So Iran will reverse 6 steps it's taken away from the deal, and the United States has to abrogate all of the executive orders that Trump put in place and lift sanctions. And Trump's tried to make that as difficult as possible for Biden to do. But the ideas that people had, that the JCPOA has to be expanded, that missiles, regional proxies of Iran, regional situation have to be added to JCPOA. I think that's a much more unrealistic goal given where we are and given the priorities of the US. Because if you don't create stability with Iran, the United States will end up in a conflict in the region, and that will impact its ability to manage China and other sets of things. So it's sort of a realistic American foreign policy will have to de-escalate in the Middle East. And de-escalation in the Middle East means that the goals have to be realistic, which is you can go back to 2016, but to expect to have a much bigger nuclear deal that fixes everything with Iran, I think is going to get the administration into trouble, and then they can forget about other priorities.
Lastly, before I let the other panelists also come into the spiel here, on the Abraham Accord that the Trump administration introduced, UAE then established diplomatic relations with Israel, Bahrain, we saw Morocco and Sudan. How is the Biden administration going to deal with this? Are they going to build on this, or are they going to backtrack on some of this? And how tricky is this kind of coming up at during the lame duck period of Mr. Trump, that hasn't been that lame duck in this respect, and not in a lot of other aspects either?
Well, there are different tracks here. I mean, I think it's significant. It has broken a taboo in the Middle East and in the Muslim world as a whole about recognition of Israel. But it doesn't bring peace to the region. In fact, it might intensify rivalries. Now you have the region in blocks, which is the group of Arab countries plus Israel versus Iran on the one side versus Turkey on the other side. So there's a lot more to be done to bring peace to the region. But one problem the Biden administration will have is the way that Trump negotiated the Abraham Accord, which is to give away things on a transactional basis, which can be bad precedents. In other words, F-35 fighters for UAE, taking Sudan willy-nilly off the terrorism list without other commitments, and then particularly recognition of Western Sahara for Morocco. I mean, that's a sort of a one-off kind of foreign policy that is exactly the kind of thing that the United States does not want to do if it really wants to go back to some kind of a normative world order. So I think Biden would have to deal with what Trump has promised in order to get the Abrahamic Accord. That's going to be problematic. But I think they should support the ideas of relations in the region, and then see how they can use the Abrahamic Accord to actually de-escalate with Turkey and Iran as well.
So if I get you right, Iran will get, there will be more dialogue with Iran, tougher policy on Turkey. Israel maybe will face a bit of a tougher and rougher situation with the new administration.
Yes, but I also think the Biden administration will push Iran and the Arabs to talk to each other. I mean, the idea that there's no conversation across the Persian Gulf is part of the problem. And I think both Saudi Arabia and UAE may end up in direct conversations with Iran.
Thank you so much, Vali. And we're all also very curious if you're going to end up in one of the positions now when the secretaries are confirmed in the Senate, but you don't need to comment on that. Adrian, I now leave the rest of the moderation in your able hands, and thank you to the three panelists. It's been a pleasure.
Birger, thank you very much. Fascinating to hear some of those thoughts, but I want to turn, if I can, to Adam Tooze, who not only wrote Crashed, which is the book about the 2000 and a financial crisis, but I think wrote one of the most interesting pieces I read this year, which was something called Whose Century, which was published in the middle of the year, asking really the question that I think all of us want answered, which is which power will come to be seen as effectively running the agenda for this century, and particularly in respect of the big challenge that faces all of us, which is the challenge of climate change. What we've seen in the response to the pandemic is individual private enterprise stepping up to develop new vaccines. We've seen different countries competing to deliver them. But Adam, does what you've observed from the pandemic give you encouragement, or does it give you sleepless nights in respect of what that might mean for tackling the even bigger topic, which is how the world deals with a climate that is warming dangerously?
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. It's absolutely a fascinating array of expertise that we have here. Let me try and answer your question, Adrian, and bend it back towards Dambisa's extraordinarily pessimistic view of Europe. And just to engage in the sort of friendly back and forth on this, why I think does the world look very different from the point of view of European decision makers right now? Because believe it or not, they, I think, are broadly speaking in rather a cocky mood, one might almost say, about the 2020, not from the point of view of a public health outcome. Obviously, it's been a shambles for Europe, as it has for much of the world outside East Asia, and neither, and the point that Dambisa made is very well taken, from the point of view of long-run growth. You know, if there is an area of the world which has a long-run growth problem, it's clearly Europe. But there are three things, I think, that make them optimistic. And the first is that in handling the crisis, bits of the European welfare state functioned in ways that we have not seen before. And the crucial thing here is that Europe is not currently suffering from the kind of unemployment crisis that the United States has experienced. Why? Because they pioneered, adopted, extended the short-time working model that the Germans used to deal with the 2008-9 crisis. And if the situation in Britain is not even worse than it is, it's in large part because the British Conservative government, to many people's surprise, adopted a similar system. So innovation, not if you like in growth, but in constantly modifying the welfare state of already very affluent societies, is one, as it were, thing the Europeans credit themselves with. Crucial also with thinking about, to come back to Adrian's question, the just transition question. The Europeans are working on their welfare state systems. The second dimension is the breakthrough that was alluded to earlier on fiscal policy. The Europeans feel that they have moved themselves towards building a fiscal apparatus capable of moving big chunks of money, trillions of euros all of a sudden, through common debt raising of various types. It isn't on the scale of American fiscal policy. Europeans' deficits this year will be half those of the United States, 9–10% of GDP as opposed to 18%. One might have asked for more, but nevertheless, a major breakthrough. And the third crucial thing bites directly on your question, which is that they have been able to maintain focus on the Green Deal. Many people, I think, were worried this year that with the shock of COVID, this would displace the Green Deal agenda from the center of European politics. It hasn't happened. The focus is still there. And in the critical negotiations that went on last week, we saw an extraordinary coupling together of three agenda items. The classic Eurozone a bugbear of common fiscal policy, which they think they've ticked off. The new issue of East-West divisions with regards to the question of the rule of law, and this is what consumed 8 hours all the way through the night, is the commitment to 55% decarbonisation by 2030, and in detail negotiations about carbon pricing and how that will transfer resource within Europe. So if you look, as it were, and they're doing this whilst another team is negotiating Brexit. So if you look at, as it were, not I admit, Dambisa would say, the innovative capacity of the European economy, but if you're looking for sophisticated, affluent democracies juggling a lot of balls simultaneously, this is why I think a lot of Europeans come out the end of this year thinking, you know what, we've at least sized up the problem. We're dealing with all of the key dimensions of how affluent societies are going to meet the challenges of the 21st century, and we're doing it collectively, for better or worse. all of us simultaneously in the room. It's very laborious, it's very slow, but it's actually the sort of politics that we need going forward. To come to this question of, are we going to cope? Well, that will then depend crucially, I think, on the negotiations between three actors in the first instance, Europe, China, and the United States on climate. And it'll point towards COP26 and whether or not the European push with China that triggered Xi Jinping's announcement in September for carbon neutrality by 2060 can now be doubled by an agreement between the Europeans and a Biden administration to double down for further ambition. And then beyond that, and I think the really new frontier is going to be, what is the role of the dynamic, relatively affluent parts of the world in enabling the constituency that Dan Bizo was pointing to, the EMs with 50 million populations, the Turkeys, Philippines, Indonesias, Malaysias of this world, to join the bandwagon towards rapid decarbonisation as well. And I think that's really the key challenge for leadership from the EU, the United States and China going forward from here. Because we are getting those commitments to decarbonisation from the rich countries, from the South Koreas, the Japans and so on now. But really, this is a whole world problem. If you look at where the CO2 growth is coming from nowadays, it's actually in the so-called ROW, rest of the world category, which is where you have 2 billion plus people with desperate demand for energy consumption. And we need to be in a position to provide them with the low-cost energy solutions that they need, from which we have profited. And the technologies are there. So now it's a question really of rolling out the infrastructure, establishing the financing, de-risking the lending. That, I think, is where the horizon is.
And one of the countries that has been at the forefront of offering potential solutions like that and offering the money to back it up has been China. But China now seems to be stepping back a little bit from some of the expansive commitments that it made, say, 5-10 years ago in the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes, that's true, but that may be an opportunity because the One Belt, One Road program was so heavily carbon based. I mean, it was a death warrant essentially for the planet in terms of climate. If everyone stops dead and fully meets Paris, but the programs already contracted under One Belt, One Road go ahead, those ROW EMs, the big EMs, which China has quite rightly focused its strategy on, will blow us through the carbon budget that we have available. So a temporary halt, a rethink, is in fact, I think, a restructuring opportunity. And if one reads Xi's promise, not just as a statement to the outside world, but as the opening gambit in an extremely complex battle inside China's political economy about reorientating the Chinese growth machine away from fossil fuels, a sudden stop in One Belt, One Road lending may actually open the door to a big rethink. And a lot of people who are in contracts with China over dirty fossil fuel projects will in fact welcome the opportunity to renegotiate those deals.
Interesting. Stay with us, Adam. I want to turn to Tammy Tam, editor of the South China Morning Post. Tammy, thanks for joining us and being part of today's panel. China obviously is undergoing an incredible transition right now. We're seeing the economy almost turning back in on itself, but we're also seeing the way China's responded to the pandemic and kind of bounced out of it, offering a kind of hope that the global economy can follow suit and do something similar. How does the world's response to 2020 and the pandemic challenge look from sitting from where you're sitting in Hong Kong? Get you unmuted, I think, because we can see you, but we can't hear you. There we go. We can hear you now. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Hey, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. It's really my honor. I think here in SMP, we focus, our focus to cover China with Asia perspective. I think other panelists, we talk about, the US and climate change and COVID and everything. And for China, really, for the time being, the top priority of the Chinese government is to contain the pandemic. And we also see that even though the first case was from in China, from Wuhan, but interestingly, China is also the first country that we see its economy starting to picking up But I believe, or from what we covered, we also realized the Chinese leaders, they realized they do have a sense of crisis. Even though the Chinese economy is kind of picking up, they understand there is still a lot to do. And here in Hong Kong, actually, COVID, we are entering into our fourth wave, and we are also trying very hard to contain it. But back to China right now, I think the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges for China is the China-US relations. We all know that this under the future Biden administration, we still don't quite know what the direction will be. But for the time being, I think the Chinese leadership, they will see they don't have to do much for the time being because they understand the China-US relations has forever changed under the Biden, under the Trump administration. And now, for Biden, we believe his focus in the first 100 days or in his early stage will be quite domestic. And Biden's first priority will be fighting COVID, and from urging greater attention to mask and social distancing and to push distribution of vaccines. And that also makes Beijing unlikely to do anything but continue a wait-and-see approach while doing what it believes is the right thing to do domestically. So right now, Xi Jinping or the Chinese leadership, their latest decision includes focusing on antitrust, preventing what the Chinese leadership call the disordered expansion of capital for the sake of maintaining financial security of China. And very interestingly, the Chinese leadership just early this week decided to start the demand side of reform after years of a supply side reform, because they believe there's a very significant, very important for China to maintain a healthy growth of domestic consumption. From my perspective, or from the Chinese China's perspective, we do see that year 2021 is still full of challenges in terms of economy for China.
How concerned should or are the government in Beijing about China's relationship with both the US and Europe? Because there does seem to be a pivot and a deterioration in that relationship. We're seeing it in technology, we're seeing it in the area of politics. There seems to be a sense now that a growing frostiness in both Brussels and in Washington towards Beijing. How concerned do you think policymakers and leaders in Beijing will be? And also, do you see them doing anything or taking any steps to change those perceptions in the year ahead?
I think one of the panelists mentioned this importance of stability. I think to the Chinese leaders, you're right, they do have concerns, but that kind of concern, I think they turned it into, well, when the US has this kind of election every 4 years, now we're talking about whether Trump will come back in 4 years' time, but in China, it's a completely different system, you like it or not. President Xi will stay in power for quite some time, and as long as the Chinese government continues this, socialism systems, very different system. I think there is, in a sense, there's a continuity in China. So when China sees this, there are a lot of uncertainties in China-US relations, and also understandably, President-elect Biden, after he comes to the White House, he will try his best to rebuild relationship with the US European allies, and that's something kind of a headache to Beijing because under President Trump, I think Beijing feel a little bit more relieved because the alliance between US and Europe is not that strong. So in the future, I think China, they need to consider if President Biden can form a stronger alliance with the West. That may be a huge challenge to China. But on the other hand, simply because the continuity or the stability in terms of the political system and in terms of the Chinese leadership, it also gives China more confidence to, hey, let's do things what we think is the right thing to do, like economy, technology, and all this. So right now, the Chinese leadership is very much focusing on pushing ahead technology in China and pushing ahead as I mentioned just now, to the antitrust and the preventing the disorder expansion of capitals in China. All of this is for the sake of the existence of China and the financial security, and to push ahead China's economic development. And the latest is about this dual circulation, which means not just exporting, but to ensure high quality of domestic consumption, because the Chinese leadership believe there is a significant, big enough domestic market to support the economy. But having said all this, when President Xi pledged the carbon neutral goal by year 2060, I think that shows China still wants to show the whole world it wants to continue to be a global player. And in this regard, I do think China and the US, if regardless of all the differences and conflicts, probably the climate issue is the area that China and US can work together. Because President Trump has pulled the US out from the Paris Accords, but President-elect Biden has made it very clearly that when he comes into the White House, the first thing he will do is to rejoin the Paris Accords, and he also appointed a special climate envoy who knows about China, and China is more than willing to continue to be a global player in climate change. And I believe China will be happy to work with the US in this regard, because when it comes to China-US relations, technology, trade, there are a lot of conflicts there. But when it comes to climate, I see there is a less conflicts there.
That's a great note on which to draw us really to a conclusion. I wanted to very quickly just nip round to all of our panelists and just ask them, as they look ahead at 2021, on the back of something you said, how, in very short framing, how optimistic, pessimistic are they about movement on this big climate issue between countries? We've got Britain playing a leading role, in fact, in bringing together countries in Glasgow at the end of 2021. George Osborne, perhaps I could just turn to you and say, do you have, with all your experience, any optimism about the possibilities for getting some change, given that we've seen a bit more collaborative spirit in the world's reaction to the pandemic?
Yeah, I am pretty optimistic because I think you have an alignment of the planets, if you like. We're talking about our planet. You have a Biden administration, that's obviously the game. You have a European Union that has developed through its complex process. And, I agree actually with what Adam was saying. I think they've had a not bad year, the European Union. They've got a package now. You've got the Chinese Green Deal. You've got Britain, which is pretty good at hosting international conferences. And has an experienced public bureaucracy doing that. So everything is aligned, and you have a world that wants a bit of stimulus, and so the kind of alignment with the kind of green investment works. And I would just sort of end on this final note. For all the kind of horrors of 2020, it is the first time human society has taken on a virus, and in the space of 9 months or whatever it is, found a vaccine to it, and found the resources, at least in the developed world, to protect many citizens who otherwise would have lost their jobs or lost their businesses as a result. And that, for all the difficulty that's caused, it's still been an extraordinary example of human innovation and spirit in tackling this act of nature. Now we have an act of humankind, if you like, climate change, and in some ways harder to solve. But I do think you have this unique opportunity in the year ahead.
Thank you. Dambisa, you were pessimistic on the economic prospects. Are you a bit more optimistic on perhaps the diplomatic and negotiation prospects for tackling climate change?
I like to be to think of myself as being pragmatic. I'm all about constructive, moving forward, human progress, etc. But let's not forget that there are somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion people on the planet today who do not have access to regular, cost-effective, sustainable energy. So we might be sitting here on a Zoom call and, largely uninterrupted. There are many Africans, South Americans, Asians who went back home in March, some of them from the best universities in the United States and in Europe, and they've not been able to dial into classes. We cannot forget that these big scale challenges have trade-offs. I'm not saying that means that the world can't move forward, but we cannot ignore the second order implications, whether that means collapse of countries in economics and politics elsewhere, which could lead to disorderly migration. These are some of the possible consequences of the sort of more aggressive approach that some people support, defunding energy companies, etc. We have to be a bit more nuanced and sort of thoughtful about the approach. I am very optimistic about the conversations coming through in 2021 on COP26, but I think in all of these issues, climate, growth, etc., we're more and more going to have to face the stark realities of trade-offs and second-order consequences in a more sort of adult manner.
Yeah, we're just running a little bit over our time, but I think we can just bring in some last words from Vali and from Adam. Vali, is John Kerry, we spoke to him a couple of weeks ago here, in fact, just before his appointment as the climate envoy. Do you think that that appointment and that commitment from the incoming Biden administration is going to demonstrate that American leadership is back in the back end of 2021 on this issue?
Yes, it does demonstrate that with Biden being president rather than Trump, one has to be more optimistic. But in reality, the dysfunction and the divisions within the American political system are also a reality. So and the climate issue is likely to be politicized. So there are significant hurdles for the United States to be truly effective in moving the ball forward.
And Adam, just last word to you, if I may. You wrote at the middle of this year rather, that as we look at tackling that climate change issue, the prospects of getting Europe and China and the US to come together are still very, very fragile. How encouraged are you about the COP process and the possibility with the incoming US administration with China's commitment so we can actually see some movement in 2021?
I think the politics are there. I actually agree with George, the stars may align, but what makes me fundamentally even more optimistic is I think this is rapidly moving beyond politics. This is now essentially a question of technology and economics. And I think the end game for the fossil fuel industries has begun. They know it. And this is the first year in which renewable energy has completely met the growth in energy demand globally. It's the first year in which 100% has been covered by new renewable sources. So it's a question now of how we unwind our fossil fuel addiction. We've shown that we can do it, and that is the future, and that's what realism and that's what adults are going to be talking about.
Thank you very much. From Borja, myself, to George, Dambisa, Vali, Adam, Tammy, and all of you watching and joining us, thank you very much. And if we don't see you before, have a very good holiday season and a better 2021 than the world has had perhaps in 2020. So thank you all, and goodbye from us here in Geneva in Switzerland. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.